Hello, Hugh Ross here. What you're about to watch is a lecture that I gave to seminary students at A.W. Tozer Seminary. The goal of this lecture is to present the flood model we're developing here at Reasons to Believe and to demonstrate that it's not enough to take the Bible literally, but you must look at all of the Bible passages about the flood and interpret them consistently as well. I hope that in the next hour you hear more than simply some details about the flood of Noah's day. My goal is that you gain a greater understanding of the power of an infinite God who is caringly involved in the history of humanity. That is what we're discovering across all the scientific disciplines. The evidence is exponentially growing to support rather than erode the truth claims of the God of the Bible. What you're about to hear is a scenario that has been constructed from the best knowledge the scientific and theological communities have thus far. As the years come, we'll continue to revise and update our model, but as you will hear, this is a proposal that synthesizes a literal and consistent interpretation of all the Bible passages relating to the flood of Noah's day with the best scientific data we have from across the scientific disciplines. Tonight's the night what we're going to be putting to the test different models for the Genesis flood. So tonight we're going to cover 4 chapters, 6, 7, 8, and 9. But we're not going to be covering just those 4 chapters. We're going to go through the entire Bible and pick up every account in the Bible that deals with the Genesis flood. And one of the reasons why there's so much controversy about the Genesis flood is because, like with the young earth issue and theistic evolution, people only look at a few limited passages rather than everything that the Bible's got to reveal. So remember our first lecture, the focus of this course is integration, integrating all 66 books of the Bible and integrating all the different scientific disciplines. Now, there are many models for the flood, but there's really only 4 Genesis flood models that have any kind of public prominence, and so we're going to limit ourselves to just these 4, and really that's 99.9% of what people talk about in terms of interpretations of what Genesis says about the flood. So the 4 we're going to cover: the global inundation, the idea that the entire globe is inundated by the Genesis flood. One that's popular amongst old earth creationists, that the Mesopotamian plain was flooded, but nothing else. A third one, which is a brand new model for the Genesis flood, is that the flood inundated a good chunk of Arabia, all of Mesopotamia, as well as the Persian Gulf. And about a year and a half ago, you probably saw promoted on a number of TV shows, I think it was on both Discovery and PBS, the idea that the Genesis flood was explained by an overflow of the Black Sea. So those are the 4 models we'll look at, kind of one at a time. So the first thing we're going to look at is the most controversial aspect of the flood. We'll hit the big controversies first, then the lesser controversies as we go through. And again, the theme of this class is, rather than ignoring these biblical creation controversies, of dealing with them, but dealing with them in such a way that through integration, we can bring peace and resolution. Noah's flood. Is it global or is it local? So that's the first thing we're going to look at. How extensive was the Genesis flood? Probably the most popular model for the flood within the church is the idea that it inundated the entire globe. I'm positing that this is not a scientific debate. It's limited to what the Bible's got to say on this issue. And if it was a scientific debate, if it were, scientists independent of any reading of the Bible would acknowledge at least some evidence for a recent global flood, and that's not the case. You really won't find any scientists who will give even a tiny modicum of evidence scientifically for a recent global flood. And also, like the young earth, old earth debate, this debate is recent. You don't really see the church getting very concerned about this issue until this gentleman shows up, Charles Darwin. Only since the rise of evolutionary theory has the church divided over the extent of Noah's flood. And only since then has people have really looked at this as a vital doctrine of the church. Now, Flood geology was launched by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And a lot of the credit goes to this gentleman, George McCready Price. And those are all the books that he wrote over the course of his lifespan. And so a prolific writer. He was a Canadian amateur geologist. He did have a couple of college classes under his belt, one in mineralogy in particular, but he did not have a degree in geology or paleontology, but was a prolific writer and a gifted speaker. And rapidly, the idea of flood geology spread far beyond just the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And just to give you a quick definition, flood geology is not only the theory that the flood of Noah inundated the entire planet, it's also the theory that that flood that lasted 13 months is responsible for all the geological features on the earth, as well as responsible for all the fossils. So what flood geology posits is that the flood covered the entire planet. It's responsible for all the geological features, responsible literally for all the plate tectonic activity that's ever taken place over most of the history of the earth, and also is responsible for all the fossils. So all that is squeezed into that 13-month episode of the flood of Noah. And so people have contrasted it, say, for example, with a catastrophic flood versus a tepid flood. So, you got the old earth perspective, which basically adopts the idea that the flood happened, but it was relatively tepid in terms of what it did to the geology of the earth, whereas the global flood model says that it was a catastrophic event, carved the Grand Canyon, literally was responsible for the Himalayas. 8,000 miles of plate tectonic activity, movement took place during that 13-month period. Diving into this, we appreciate that it's not a scientific debate, but it is a biblical debate. And so what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is basically give you a summary of a lecture I gave to an audience, and the subject of my talk was Genesis flood, is it global or worldwide? Now, the resolution key here is the same one we mentioned last Monday. When you want to deal with these kinds of issues, it's critical to integrate all the relevant biblical accounts and texts. And so what I did with that audience was to take them through the Bible and go through every place in the Bible where it talks about a worldwide event that has not anything to do with the flood. So I skipped all the passages that had to do with the flood. It says, first, let's just look at everything else the Bible's got to say about worldwide phenomena that are not on the topic of the flood. Well, these are the passages you'll find. Genesis 41 and 42, 1 Kings 10, Acts 2:5, Romans 1:8, and Colossians 1:6. And again, if you remember Monday, when dealing with these kinds of issues, trying to bring resolution, it's critical that you bring in not only Old Testament passages, but New Testament passages. So on purpose, I went through an exhaustive list of what the Old Testament had to say, as well as the New Testament. So we'll pick these up one at a time. The first one we'll pick up is the story of Joseph. So here's Joseph with his brothers coming to buy grain. And what does it say in Genesis 41:57? All the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe in all the world. And then you notice just a few verses later in chapter 42, it says the famine had spread throughout the whole of the Egyptian empire and the land of Canaan. In other words, the whole world for Joseph was the entire Egyptian empire plus the land of Canaan. Now, at that time, the Egyptian empire was quite large. It included all of Sudan, included all of what is presently Egypt, parts of Ethiopia and Libya, and Canaan, and maybe even parts of Syria were included. But it did not include Australia and New Zealand or South America. And so people were not coming from those nations to be fed by Joseph. So clearly, in that context, the whole world is quite a bit less than the globe. Actually defines it as less than the globe right there in the text. The second story I want to pick up is that of Solomon. And here's the Queen of Sheba visiting Solomon to hear of his wisdom. And it says in 1 Kings 4:34, men and apparently women of all nations listened to Solomon's wisdom sent by all the kings of the world. So all the kings of the world were sending their wise intellectual leaders to Solomon to hear of his wisdom. And it's repeated in 1 Kings 10:24, where it says, the whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. Well, if you read into 1 Kings 4:31 and Chronicles 9, it tells us that these kings and queens and these wise nobles from all these different nations, they came from as far away as Sheba and all the lands of Arabia. Now that's bigger than the world of Joseph, but it's hardly including North and South America and Australia or Antarctica. It's limited to the lands of Sheba. That would be Ethiopia. Sheba and Ethiopia are one and the same. Maybe countries a little bit around there. Clearly Egypt, probably Asia Minor, the land of Canaan, Syria, and then as far away as the lands of southern Arabia. But that's certainly not the whole globe, even though it's referred to as worldwide. Well, that's the Old Testament list. The first relevant passage we pick up in the New Testament is in the book of Acts, chapter 2, verse 5, where the text says there were Jews living in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven. And this is a time when the diaspora had taken place, where Jews were scattered to the land of Israel to some degree throughout the different nations, all nations under heaven. And, in that time, the whole world would have been the world of the Roman Empire. So it means that they came from all the provinces of the Roman Empire. The point I'm driving at here in going through these Old and New Testament passages is the Bible uses this phrase worldwide or all the world or the whole world or all the nations under heaven, and in each case it means something less than the globe. Therefore, when you see a phrase like that with reference to the flood, there's no need to think of it as referring to the entire planet. So I'm simply establishing a biblical pattern here that just because a text says it's the whole world doesn't mean it's the whole planet. And so I'm purposely taking you through all the biblical examples that are not pertaining to the flood. And when I'm showing you, they consistently use that phrase worldwide or the whole world or all the nations to mean something much less than the whole planet. A small fraction of the whole planet for that matter. Okay, that's Acts 2. Paul uses phrases like this, and Peter as well, as you'll see. Paul says, your faith is being reported all over the world. Romans 1. So that's a letter written to the Romans, and he says to the Roman Christians, your faith is being reported all over the world. And so scholars have always recognized Romans 1:8 as a reference to the Roman Empire and no more. And so it's not the whole planet, it's just the Roman Empire. And there's really not much dispute over that. Paul repeats this again. In Colossians 1:6, he says all over the world, this gospel that he was preaching is producing fruit and growing, just as it had been doing among you. Well, what was the world of Paul? His whole world was the extent of the Roman Empire. Notice how he desired to go to Spain. His goal in life was to actually take the gospel throughout the entire world, which to him was all the provinces of Rome. He didn't get to go to Spain. He didn't get to go to Britain, for example, or for that matter, to Gaul, but he did take the gospel through a good section of the eastern portion of the Roman Empire. Notice that every one of these passages, in using these phrases, the whole world or all the nations, in every single case, is referring to less than the entire globe. So simply proving that all the Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 texts are using references to the whole world or all the people doesn't prove that necessarily it covered the whole globe. I would agree that it doesn't eliminate it, but it doesn't prove it. That's one step you can use to demonstrate that there is not a biblical argument for a global flood. There's a stronger argument when you begin to look at the flood passages outside of Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9. I'm going to do that, but then we're going to end up by looking at what the flood text itself says. There's actually evidence in the flood chapters themselves, but first let me take you to the to the texts outside the book of Genesis that deal with the extent of the Noahic flood. And if you remember on Monday, I think we also mentioned this on Wednesday, there are several texts in the Bible that parallel Genesis 1 in taking you through the 6 creation days. Job 38 and 39 address the content of the 6 days, as does Proverbs 8 and Psalm 104. So we're going to look at those 3 texts in particular and to see what it's got to say about creation day 3. Now, notice in those texts it doesn't number the days, but it covers the content of all 6 days. And so as you read through those creation accounts, find the place where it talks about day 3 and see what it says about the extent of the water. So looking at the biblical extent of the Noahic flood. And again, the resolution key here, integrate all the biblical flood accounts and texts. Don't just look at Genesis chapter 1. What we're going to do in this class is actually look at all the biblical texts. So integrate all these biblical texts. And here's a list of the biblical flood accounts. Now, some of these may be just a few verses, but these are the texts that actually address the issue of the flood and its extent. Now, the first one I want to take you into is Job 38. Job 38 and 39 is the most extensive of all the biblical creation accounts. Quite a bit more content in those 2 chapters than you'll find in Genesis 1, for example. And in fact, we'll be talking about Job on Wednesday and Thursday and giving you some textual evidence that the book of Job's content predates that of Genesis by 4, 5, or 6 centuries. And in that case, we would look at the Job creation accounts as foundational to understanding the Genesis creation accounts. They predate the Genesis creation accounts. Well, when Job 38 addresses creation day 3, and what's interesting about Job 38 and 39 too, God is speaking. So it's a direct quotation from God himself. It's actually a more direct creation account than what you get in Genesis 1. God is speaking. It's the one creation account where God actually is speaking directly. And he says, "Who shut up the sea behind doors when it bursts forth from the womb, when I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place?" So that's a reference to creation day 3. And before the 3rd day, water covered the whole planet. And if you remember on Wednesday, I described to you how recent discoveries in plate tectonics has enabled us to reconstruct the growth of the continental land masses, and the period when these continental land masses were experiencing their most aggressive growth was about 2 billion years ago, which would really fit on creation day 3 if you look at the past 4 billion years as covering those 6 days. And so Genesis does get the timing right with respect to what modern science establishes for the growth of the continental land masses. But notice what this text says. It refers to God separating the waters from the land masses, but it refers to setting up these barriers, these doors, these boundaries for the oceans. And it uses phrases like fixed limits and set doors and bars. Now, it's not explicitly saying that this is a permanent barrier to the waters, but it certainly is implying it with the phrase fixed and set, and using things like doors and bars and limits. It is at least indicating that from creation day 3 forward, there were permanent barriers separating the land masses from the water. And on that basis, you would conclude that the flood of Noah could not be global in extent, because if it was, why this reference to fixed doors and bars and barriers? Now, where Job 38 is implicit, Psalm 104 is explicit. Psalm 104, just like Job 38 and 39, takes you through all 6 creation days. And I got a couple of slides here. This is what it says in the beginning of its discussion about creation day 3. The psalmist is speaking, referring to God. He says, "You covered it," what is referring to the earth, "with the deep. The waters stood above the mountains. So that's a reference to what the earth was like before creation day 3. The waters covered all the undersea mountains. There were no land masses above the surface of the water. But at your rebuke, the waters fled. They went down into the valleys to the place you assigned for them. And with plate tectonics, you would get a rippling of the surface crust of the earth. So there'd be low spots and high spots. The water would flow down to the low spots. The high spots would now stand above sea level. That's what Psalm 104 verses 6, 7, and 8 are referring to. The key verse is the one that follows, verse 9. In verse 9, the psalmist says of God, you set a boundary they, namely the waters, cannot cross. Never again will they cover the earth. So there you have a very strong, direct, explicit statement that once the continental land masses are set in place, never again will the waters cover the whole surface of the earth. So that would categorically rule out the possibility of the flood being global in extent. Never again will they cover the earth. Proverbs 8, which also takes you through the 6 creation days, in reference to verse or creation day 3, says of God, he gave the sea its boundary so the water would not overstep his command. In other words, Proverbs 8 is telling that God gave a command to the water that they would have to stay within certain confined limits. And because of that boundary, that water could never overstep the command of God. Using the phrase command means, look, God is sovereign over the waters. When he commands the waters, they obey. That's not going to happen. Okay, this is what it says in 2 Peter 3:6. In the English translation, by water also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. Now, what Peter is really doing here is contrasting the world that he lives in, namely the Roman world, with the world of Noah. And the reason why I would say that is, you notice, he does not qualify the Greek word cosmos. So let's actually look at it in the Greek, the phrase, the world of that time. And in the Greek New Testament, it's tote cosmos. Now, the Greek word cosmos can mean the entire universe. It can mean all of planet Earth. It can mean a nation on planet Earth. It has a lot of different definitions. But typically it doesn't refer to your backyard. You don't call your backyard the cosmos. So it is a little narrower in definition than the Hebrew word eretz, which can mean the whole world, or it can mean a nation, or a city, or literally your backyard. But the Greek word cosmos always means something big, either the whole nation, the whole planet, or a portion of the planet, or literally the entire universe. But notice here the word cosmos is qualified by Peter. It's tote cosmos. Now what that tote means is the world at the time the event took place. And so the very fact that Peter chooses to qualify the word cosmos, in my opinion, establishes he's making a statement that the flood of Noah is not, or probably the world of Noah that was flooded, is not as large as the world in which he lives in, the Roman world. So that would kind of establish a maximum limit for the extent of the flood of Noah. It could not be as extensive as the entire Roman Empire, something a little more limited than that. So that would be an upper limit based on what we see stated here in 2 Peter 3. Now, to support the idea that it would be global in extent, that word tote would have to be dropped. The very fact that the cosmos is qualified at all establishes that it can't be the whole globe. So, but moving on, we notice in 2 Peter 2:5, it also addresses the flood. It's a passage that's often overlooked. What it says in 2 Peter 2:5, he, referring to God, brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. And my point here is, once again, Peter is qualifying the Greek word cosmos. He didn't say he brought a flood upon the world. He said he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, implying that the world of the ungodly is not as large as the entire planet. Matter of fact, I think he's doing the same thing he did in 2 Peter 3. He's implying that it's a world that's smaller than the Roman world. It's also crucial for what we're going to be studying in the second lecture that we're going to give today, in that one of the ways to get some insight in the flood is to study everything the Bible's got to say about God pouring out his wrath upon the ungodly. So that's another thing, but we're going to save that for the second lecture. What does the Bible say about the extent of his wrath that he pours out upon the ungodly? But before we do that, let's look at the exegetical case, the strongest exegetical case that global flood proponents present. So what is their exegetical case? And it's basically one verse. What you get is Genesis 7:19, where it says, the waters rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. And so when I'm confronted by global flood proponents, that's the passage they go to, and then they supplement it with a variety of passages in Genesis 7 and 8, which speak about all the animals being wiped out and all the people being wiped out who are outside the ark. But this is really their foundational text. The waters rose greatly on the earth. All the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. If you read the rest of the context, it says they were covered by 15 cubits of water minimum. With a short cubit, that's 22 feet. So it means there are at least 22 feet of water sitting above the high mountains. Now you'll notice that I put in square brackets here, or hills. That's done on purpose because the Hebrew word that's translated mountains is the word har. And as I mentioned on last Monday, biblical Hebrew has a real paucity of nouns, which explains why almost every Hebrew noun has multiple literal definitions. And so this word har can mean a mound in your backyard, a hill, a high hill, a mountain, or it can mean Mount Everest. All of that's included by this phrase har. Now, global flood proponents will say yes, but it's qualified by this phrase high. Well, the adjective you see there in biblical Hebrew has as its first definition elevated. And so if it's simply elevated hills, this gives a very different scenario than towering peaks inundated with the waters of the flood. And so we're going to actually examine what does it mean when it say all the elevated mountains or hills under the entire heavens were covered. Well, you can get some insight on that by going to Genesis 8:5 and 8:9. So Genesis 8:5. Now in Genesis 7, the flood waters come upon the earth. The rains fall and the underground aquifers pour water to the surface of the earth. Some have speculated a berm might have been set up that would collect melting water from the snow and ice that existed at that time. But the waters were rising greatly on the earth. That's Genesis 7. Genesis 8, the waters are receding. So now the waters are beginning to leave. And so Genesis 8:5, we have Noah here. I'm not sure that's what he looked like, but that's an artist's rendition. But now Noah's on top of the ark. So it stopped raining. He comes out on top of the ark and he looks out. And what does the verse 5 say? It says the tops of the mountains or hills, keep in mind that word har can mean either hills or mountains, became visible to Noah. So now, for the first time since the floods covered the earth, he's able to see the distant hills or mountains. And to give you kind of a picture for it, here's a scale model that someone built of the Ark of Noah. And we're going to presume he's on the highest part of that ark, 45 feet above the waters. And he looks out, and now he can see the distant hills. That's verse 5. Later in the text, verse 9, he releases a dove. So here it shows Noah releasing a dove from one of the lower windows in the ark. And here we see the dove flying out over the waters from the ark. But notice what it says in verse 9. It says the dove could find no place to set its feet because there was water over all the surface of the earth. The same phraseology you see in Genesis 7:19. The waters were covering the whole surface of the earth. Now, what's the difference? Well, the difference is probably about 30 feet. And as an astronomer, I can tell you 30 feet makes a huge difference on how far you can see. Matter of fact, this might be a good homework assignment I could give all of you, right? Calculate how much farther Goliath could see over the horizon than somebody who's only 5 feet tall. It's actually quite a remarkable distinction. Or maybe do another calculation. How much farther can you see with every 6 feet of elevation that you gain? But, it's probably a lot of you knew when you were kids. You would get up on the fence in your parents' backyard, and by getting up on top of the fence, you could actually see a little farther away than you could if you were not on top of that fence. Even a few feet makes a big difference how far away you can see. That's a principle in the sailing days. They'd have these masts on board the ships, and they would put somebody up in the crow's nest, because someone in the crow's nest could see many miles farther away than somebody was on the deck of the ship. So even being elevated just 30 feet makes a huge difference. Anyway, if you want to have some fun, just do a little bit of high school trigonometry and figure out how many more miles you can see if you got 30 feet of height advantage. You'll be amazed how much farther you can actually see away. But that's the context. Because Noah's at a higher level on top of the ark, he's able to see a greater distance away than the dove was flying low over the water. And so the dove came back to the ark because it couldn't find any place to land its feet. It couldn't see any place where the hills would be. Now, one other calculation you can work out is how extensive then would the flood have to be minimum? Well, I can tell you this. I'll kind of give you a hint on this. It means the flood would have to be more extensive than about 100 miles. Because if it was less extensive than 100 miles, then even at the height of the flood waters, you'd be able to see some of the distant hills popping up above the surface of the waters. And so, but if it's at least 100 miles in extent, then even high mountains far. Well, I mean, we live in Redding here, right? You can see Mount Shasta even though it's 80 miles away. It's because it's 14,000 feet high. But if you go down to Sacramento, you can't see it. And so, just getting away an extra 150 miles makes even a towering peak invisible to you. So that would mean that the flood, at a minimum, would have to be 200 miles across in diameter, and at maximum, it can't be bigger than the Roman Empire. So right away, we kind of got a rough handle on how big the Genesis flood is. At least a couple hundred miles in diameter, but it could be up to 3,500 miles in diameter. Yes?
In Genesis 7:19, you talked about everything except when they mentioned you could see the surface of the earth from above. It covered the entire.
Yeah, what I'm saying in Genesis 7:19 is that Noah on top of the ark, as far away as he could see, could only see water.
Remember when they brought in the flood, when the floods came?
Right.
You said that it was only, worldwide, but the view from above, it implied that they could see the entire earth was covered. That's what I was curious about.
Yes. Well, I mean, given that phrases like the whole earth, or all the nations under the heavens, everywhere else in the Bible where it's not talking about the flood refers to something less than the globe. Here in Genesis 7:19, when it says all the earth was covered with water, would imply that as far as Noah can see from one end of the horizon to the other, all he could see was water. So it'd be like he'd be in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You look out and all you can see is water. But for that matter, if you're in the middle of the Dead Sea, in the middle of the Black Sea, all you're going to see is water from one end of the horizon to the other. Matter of fact, if you're on Lake Superior, there's a spot in the middle of Lake Superior where you look and you can't see any land. It's water everywhere. So that's the kind of context we're bringing out. And so simply coming up with a list of scripture passages that makes the point that all humanity was wiped out and all the animals that were associated with human beings were wiped out except for those on board the ark doesn't necessarily prove that the flood is global in extent, particularly given these Bible passages. What I really want to get into is what does the Bible as a whole have to say about God pouring out his judgment wrath upon a reprobate society. God judged post-flood humanity for its failure to fill the earth, a command God gave to Adam and Eve, and Genesis 6 implies that pre-flood humans likewise failed to fill the earth, as does Genesis 9. Notice in Genesis 11. Notice in Genesis 11, we got the peoples of the world living in the Mesopotamian plain, and what are they saying? Let's build us a city and a tower so that we will not be scattered over the face of the earth. In other words, the post-flood peoples were resolutely disobeying God's command to multiply and fill the earth. And the story of the first 12 verses of Genesis 11 is God personally intervening and forcibly scattering humanity over the whole face of the earth. Now that implies that humanity had never fulfilled the command that God gave to Adam and Eve to fill the earth. And therefore, that's another piece of evidence that the flood of Noah cannot be global, because clearly the text implies that humanity at that time was not global. Humanity did not become globally distributed until considerably after the flood, until after the Tower of Babel incident. Now, we have other incidents in the Bible where God has to surgically remove a malignant tumor. Probably the most famous example of all would be Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, the other thing we notice that before God performs a surgery, he always sends a prophet. Notice what he did with Noah. He said, I want you to build an ark. But God's intent was that the ark would become a pulpit for the preaching of Noah, because it says in Hebrews 11, Noah preached to that wicked generation. Sure, they weren't going to repent, but God never brings his judgment wrath upon a reprobate nation until he first sends a prophet to warn them and try to bring to repentance those few people that might not yet be infected. So Noah was a prophet to his generation. Likewise, Lot was a prophet to Sodom and Gomorrah. But as you read the story of Genesis 18 and Genesis 15, what you discover is that the excise, the removal of those reprobate humans was limited to just the extent of the reprobation. And you get this interesting conversation in Genesis 18, where Abraham talks to the Lord. But if you go back to Genesis 15, Abraham has another conversation with the Lord. And this time it's about the Amorites that are living in the Judean hills with him. And these were not righteous individuals. And so the Lord has a talk with him and says, the wickedness of the Amorites has not yet reached its fullness. They are wicked. I agree with you. They are wicked people. But it's not yet reached societal reprobation. Now, in terms of what defines societal reprobation, go back to Genesis 18. Notice what the Lord does. He sends two of his angels into the city of Sodom. And notice what he commands them to do. He says, set up a tent in the town square and spend the night there. Now, God's intent was that by doing that, these angels would be able to determine the degree to reprobate behavior in that city. But Lot sees them come in. I don't think he knew they were angels, but they were two strangers that came in, and Lot was well aware of what would happen if they spent the night in the city square. And so he implores the two angelic visitors to spend the night with him. And because he implored so strongly, they consented and went with him to his home where he fed them. But you know the rest of the story. This city is completely reprobate. There's nothing left in this city except for Lot and his family. And so they perform a miracle. They blind the people at the door. And then the angels talk to Lot and say, you're getting out tonight. We're not waiting. You're leaving right now. This city is incredibly depraved and reprobate. And the Lord's going to destroy it this very night. You got to leave. Lot and his family take off. And then God pours out the brimstone. Abraham watches it all. He sees a fire from heaven go down, destroy the 5 cities of the plain, but he notices only the cities of the plain have been destroyed. Nothing else. Everything else is left untouched. There came a time when he did have to deal with the Amorites. What did he tell Abraham? Their wickedness has not yet reached its fullness, but it will 400 years from now. And then your descendants will be my instrument to remove that reprobate, cancerous, malignant, evil tumor. They will take care of it. Well, that's what the book of Joshua is all about. 400 years later, we have Joshua with the Israelite people entering the promised land. And what's the first city they run into? Jericho. And notice that every city that Joshua would enter, God would speak to him. And he said, with respect to Jericho, every man, woman, and child must be killed. All their animals must be killed. That's a reference to the nephesh animals. He didn't tell them to get rid of the cockroaches, but he had to get rid of all the nephesh creatures. And he said, even their material possessions must be destroyed. You're to touch nothing that belongs to them. Why? Because the people of the city are of such reprobate behavior that if you were even to touch their silver or their gold, you will be tainted by it. And likewise, can't save any of the animals. The animals have been so abused by these people that they're not safe for you to exploit. But there are other cities that where the Lord said, kill all the people, but keep the animals, and keep all the material goods. The reprobate behavior has not reached that level. It is safe to keep the material goods and the animals. Other places, he said, the children are fine. The children have not been tainted by the evil. You can keep the children. So there are different levels to which God said to perform the surgery. Now, again, that's difficult for us to understand because we live in a New Testament era. We live in the context of the salt of the earth. Jesus said to his disciples, when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and he was referring to the day of Pentecost, you'll become the salt of the earth. And as the salt of the earth, you'll be a preservative that prevents societal reprobation from ever occurring, which is why in New Testament historical period, ever since Jesus rose bodily from the dead, we cannot identify a single historical incident of an entire town or city or nation being totally reprobate. We can identify individuals, but we can't see an example of a whole town or city or nation, which makes it difficult in communicating, say, to 21st century secular skeptics when they read the Old Testament context. And what makes it difficult, we don't have any modern day examples of societal reprobation. So we don't see any evidences before us of, say, where all the children and even the animals and the material goods are so diseased with evil that it's unsafe to have any contact with them. And so that's where you get the problem where people say, I can't believe in the God of the Old Testament, but I can believe in the God of the New Testament. God hasn't changed. It's the human population that has changed. God's the same. If societal reprobation were to raise its ugly head today, God would deal with it in the same way he did the Old Testament era. But yes, I think we need to emphasize with the skeptics and saying this is difficult for us to comprehend because we have no modern day examples that can link us to this. But that's one reason why I think the Old Testament is 3.5 times longer than the Old Testament. It's filled with all these narratives to persuade us this is really the situation of the human heart, except for the salt effect, or preserved effect of God's Holy Spirit brought about by Christ's death and resurrection. Okay, I think I've said enough about limited destruction. I mean, we could actually go on for hours and hours, but I'm going to want to cut this off at this point. And basically, I want to encourage you to do what I've started here. Just go through the rest of the Bible and see what it says about God's judgment wrath all the way to the book of Revelation. And I'm basically guaranteeing that if you do that, you'll find a consistent pattern that God's wrath is always limited to the geographical extent, the spiritual extent of reprobate behavior. No more, no less. And if any righteous person happens to be stuck in that venue, they will get rescued. God will pull them out. Moreover, the consistent pattern you'll see, God never pours out his wrath until he first sends a prophet. You'll see that in the book of Revelation. It says 2 witnesses are going to come down from heaven and preach. They're preaching to the reprobates. So God never destroys the reprobates until he first sends a prophet. And that's got to be quite a prophet. You know, it's one thing being an evangelist and a missionary and a prophet to people who repent. It'd be really difficult to be sent by God to prophesy, evangelize people who you know ahead of time are not going to repent. But nevertheless, God has a role for people to do that very thing. Let me just spend a few minutes talking about some of the scientific evidences against a global flood interpretation. And there's a huge amount of evidence against it. But let me just give you what I have found to be particularly persuasive. And this would be the unambiguous flood signals we get in ice cores in Greenland and central Antarctica, northern Greenland and central Antarctica. So I mentioned on Wednesday, we have 3 cores in northern Greenland and 3 cores in central Antarctica. We also have a sediment core off the coast of southern New Zealand. And the whole point is this gives you a continuous record of the last several 100,000 years. If there's a flood of the extent that the global flood proponents propose, you're going to get a whopping signal in those ice layers. And so you should be able to easily see in these annual ice layers evidence for a global flood. So we go through those layers and check it out. The layers must be annual because they reveal historic volcanic eruptions. And every volcano has its own individual dust signature. And so we can actually find a layer where we see the dust signature of the eruption of Vesuvius that happened during the times of the Romans.
So there's other evidence that shows that it's synced up.
We can remove the assumptions because of our capacity to calibrate these annual layers. Now, there's several ways we can calibrate it. One is through these volcanic eruptions. And so I've showed you this one on Wednesday where we have a layer that shows the dust signature from Krakatoa in the 1880s. And then we got one from Vesuvius that goes back to the time of the Romans. And we have about a dozen different volcanic eruptions that we can pick out in these layers. Then you simply count the number of layers between one volcanic eruption and the other, where you got a historical record that identifies a number of years, and it does prove that they're annual layers. The other piece of evidence that we have is that you can see the signature of the variation in the ellipticity of Earth's orbit. And where the ellipticity becomes more extreme, you get harsher winters, and that's going to give you a different ice layer signature than when the ellipticity is more circular. And so we can see that pattern. And we also know from Newton's laws of motion that the ellipticity varies with a sinusoidal pattern of 100,000 years. And in the case of Dome C, where we got 800,000 layers, we actually see 8 cycles of the variation in the Earth's ellipticity, the ellipticity of Earth's orbit. And so it gives you 2 independent ways to calibrate the layers, but thanks to these ice cores, we can actually get a decent calibration of that. Here's what the Middle East looks like today. And here are the biblical names. Ashur being the Mesopotamian plain, the mountains of Havilah in central Arabia, and the land of Cush down by the southwestern portion. And as you heard me speak about this on Friday, I think there's good textual evidence that the Garden of Eden would have been located in what is now the southeastern portion of the Persian Gulf, simply to explain how the 4 rivers come together. If you recall, we made the point that with satellite imagery, we can identify the river, ancient river Gihon that flowed from the land of Cush. That's what it says in Genesis 2. Gihon flowed from the land of Cush, and right now it's an intermittent river because of the little rainfall there. However, at the close of the last ice age, this was a permanent large river that ran through Arabia. And then it talks about the Pishon flowing out of the mountains of Havilah, where there is gold and onyx. That's this region right here. And the river winds its way through there, flows out here, and it comes into the Persian Gulf at this point. The Gihon comes in at this point, the Tigris right here, and the Euphrates right here. But if you actually follow the ancient riverbeds, at the close of the last ice age, the Red Sea was dry and the Persian Gulf was dry. And therefore, the Tigris and the Euphrates would have flowed all the way out to here on dry land. And likewise, we got the Gihon and the Pishon flowing out here to the Straits of Hormuz. And somewhere in this region, you could perceive all 4 rivers coming together. The reason I picked that location, That's the farthest from the Gulf of Hormuz, where we would have some reasonable expectation that all 4 rivers would come together in one locale. Now, I like that too, because it tells us in Genesis 4 that Cain left the region of Eden and went to the land of Nod, which was east of Eden. And so I'm thinking Nod's somewhere around here, and that again would push Eden out into that portion of the Persian Gulf. Now, some evidence for that early date for Noah, because that would put Noah in around about 40 to 50, maybe 35,000 years ago, somewhere in that range. Some evidence for such an early date is what you see in Genesis 10:25. It says, 2 sons were born to Eber. One was named Peleg, because in his time the earth was divided. Now, if you look in Genesis 11, you've got a genealogy with 10 names between Noah and Abraham. Name number 5 is Peleg. So Peleg shows up not just in Genesis 10, he also shows up in Genesis 11. But notice what it says in Genesis 10. It says the earth was divided in the days of Peleg. Well, let me show you what the Bering Land Bridge looked like 21,000 years ago. So here you can recognize Alaska. There's Siberia, but there's a 500-mile wide bridge that joined North America to Asia just 21,000 years ago. And that bridge was intact all the way back through the last ice age, which means all the way back to about 60, 70,000 years ago. What was happening at 21,000 years ago is the bridge was warming up. And so that was a point where it was now possible for humans living here to migrate over into North America. It didn't really get warm enough for easy migration until 14,000 years ago. 14,000 years ago, this bridge got warm enough where you could actually have oats and wheat growing wild that could be harvested, which would provide a food supply for the migrators. You need that for rapid migration, a ready food supply. And then the next slide shows you what it looked like 11,500 years ago. Now, this little line you see there, that's the present coastline of Alaska. But the yellow part you see here is a coastline that existed 11,500 years ago, and likewise on the Siberia side. So you can see 11,500 years ago, the Bering Strait was just beginning to open. So that's when it cracked open, and by 11,000 years ago, it was quite a wide breach, which meant that given the conditions that existed there and the rate at which water ran through, this would no longer be passable. So starting 11,000 years ago, migration from Siberia to North America and North America back to Siberia stopped. So all the people that had migrated from Siberia over into North America between 14,000, 11,000 years ago were now stuck. They were now permanent citizens of North and South America. There was no way to get back until the 19th century. Only in the 19th century did we have shipping of adequate stability that you could safely cross the Bering Land Bridge. Before that, that wasn't the case. So, in fact, this is noted in the legends of the Haiti Indians in the Queen Charlotte Islands off the coast of British Columbia. Those are two, well, actually a rather large set of islands, two of them quite large, that are separated by 60 miles from the mainland of British Columbia. But in their legends, there's the record of the fact that they saw the sea levels rapidly rising and were making an attempt to move over to the mainland, and the sea levels rose so rapidly they couldn't pull it off, and they were literally cut off from the rest of humanity for 10,500 years in the Queen Charlotte Islands. And actually, if you look at their legends, they're recording that the sea levels were rising a minimum of 100 feet a century, which is why they were not able to mount any effort to get their peoples off. And over the course of a few centuries, it rose 500 feet. Same thing happened here in the Bering Strait. The waters there rose relative to the land by 500 feet. You say, how did that happen? Well, you had thousands of feet of ice over Canada and northern U.S. and over all of Siberia. When that ice melts, it fills up the oceans. The other thing that happens is with the removal of all that ice, the continental land masses bounce back up. And when they bounce back up, the intervening seafloor drops. And so half of the sea level rise is a result of dropping seafloors. The other half is the result of melting ice flowing into the oceans. Now, that allows us to develop a biblical date for the flood because we have an accurate historical date for Abraham. We know Abraham lived 4,000 years ago. How do you get that? Well, if you actually go through the biblical historical narratives, you'll come up with a date for Abraham living about 4,000 years ago with an error bar of plus or minus 50 years. Abraham also shows up in extra biblical texts. So the Akkadian texts mention the name of Abraham, and you can use that extra biblical historical record to also establish a date for Abraham, and it's consistent with the Bible's 4,000 years ago, give or take 50 years. And in the case of Peleg, it says the world was divided in the days of Peleg. And by the way, it wasn't just a Bering land bridge. That's when England got separated from France. And that's when it became impossible for people to island hop from Asia into Australia. And so much of the world became divided in the days of Peleg. And, carbon-14 dating puts that at 11,000 years ago for the most prominent of those bridges, the Bering Land Bridge. And so the way you calibrate this, if Peleg lived 11,000 years ago and Abraham 4,000 years ago, and if the lifespans recorded in Genesis 5 and 11 are proportional to the passage of time, then that puts Noah at about 40,000 years ago, give or take 15,000 years, and puts Adam in at about 60,000 years ago, give or take 20 or 30,000 years. And there's debate over how big those error bars should be. The debate simply arises because who says that the passage of time is proportional to the lifespans recorded? That seems reasonable, but it's something you can't prove. So on that basis, I think this is a reasonable biblical calibrated date for when the flood took place, and also it gives you a reasonable date for when God created Adam and Eve. We have an external date for the Ice Age too. And so if you're presuming that the flood covered all of the Persian Gulf and Mesopotamia, a portion of southern Arabia, that's another way to get a date. Because if you go back 40 or 50,000 years ago, this is what the Middle East looked like. The Persian Gulf was dry, the Red Sea was dry, and there's a geologist by the name of Ward Sanford, who has pointed out that there's evidence that a berm built up right here at the Hormuz Straits. Not something we can prove, but there is a very suggestive evidence that a berm formed at this time, and if that's the case, that would back up water all the way through here. And so that might explain why you had such an extensive flood. Other geologists have pointed out we don't need a berm. All you need is aggressive ice and snow melt coming off the mountains, because what they point out, you got mountains here, which have been loaded with snow and ice. These mountains would have been loaded with snow and ice. In fact, all around Mesopotamia, you got mountains that have been loaded with snow and ice, and that would have been undergoing aggressive melting at the time of the flood. And so if you want to know how extensive I think the flood of Noah was, I'm suggesting that this is a good estimate, that it covered all of Persian Gulf, all of the Mesopotamian plain, and a good chunk of southern Arabia. So something of that nature. And basically what I've done here is made the standard old earth creationist model for the flood, where the flood wipes out all of humanity. Now keep in mind, many old earth creationists believe in an extremely tepid flood that only wipes out a portion of humanity. But I would argue that's difficult to square with what the Bible teaches about the nature of God's judgment wrath. I believe it must refer to all of humanity, and except for those on board the ark, which means it's got to be a fairly big flood. Well, what you see here is a flood extent that's at least 4 times bigger than the old earth creationist model where the flood wipes out all of humanity. This would allow human beings to be residing in the Persian Gulf, Mesopotamia, and parts of Arabia, and not just in the region around the city of Ur. the ancient city of Ur. So, and that flood is big enough that if you got the ark floating around in here, you're not going to be able to see the hills and mountains. It's going to take the receding of the waters to a sufficient degree where the ark is now going to be in a spot where you can see the hills and mountains. I'm saying this is a proposal. Maybe I'm making the flood too big, maybe I'm making it too small, but I think we're in a reasonable right ballpark. And we can do more. In fact, that's the argument of Ward Sanford. Let's do more geology in this area. He says a few of us have done there, but we haven't poured any real money or time into this. If we were to actually go there and do some serious geological work, maybe we can come up with a more precise model. So, but at this point, there's nothing within the record of nature that would be a threat to this proposal. And before we alter it, let's wait till we get that kind of evidence. But right now, I think we got something that could be biblically faithful, as well as scientifically faithful. And given that, both sides are moving to meet in the middle, and we're making no compromise on the doctrine of a worldwide flood, I think we've got the basis to resolve this thing. And maybe we're not going to resolve the old earth, young earth thing, but if we can resolve this, that's a step in the right direction. Yeah. So I'm reasonably optimistic, you might say naive, that maybe we can actually make some headway here. Well, if you kind of go on Wikipedia or Watch Discovery or PBS, it's making the claim that 7,400 years ago, the Black Sea was dammed up here at the Dardanelles and overflowed and inundated an area of over 1 million square miles. And they're claiming that's the explanation for the flood that we see recorded in the book of Genesis. And you say, why are secular documentaries actually trying to make that claim? Well, remember we said at the beginning of today how you find the flood story in over 150 different cultural groups and ethnic societies? Well, PBS has noticed that and said there's got to be some reality to the flood in order to explain all these historical accounts. And so they said, this is it. The Black Sea overflowed, inundated 1 million square miles. But the problem with that theory, wrong time. It's too late. Given our calibration of the Genesis 11 genealogy, it's got to be a lot earlier than 7,400 years ago. And also, it's the wrong region. It's too far west, and it only flooded 1 million square miles. Too limited in extent, and it certainly wouldn't wipe out all the peoples that exist on the face of the earth at that time. Although there are old earth creationists who are very comfortable with that. They say, we don't believe that it wiped out everybody anyway. And so they're getting all excited about this new model for the flood. But I'd argue that it has serious inconsistencies with what the Bible teaches. Bottom line, no scientific or biblical reasons exist for doubting the account of Noah and the flood. What about the search for Noah's Ark? That's Mount Ararat here, 17,000 feet high, kind of like Mount Shasta, only a little bit higher, but it's got permanent snow on it, just like Mount Shasta has. And it's about the same difficulty to climb as Mount Shasta, for those of you that are interested. But that's where all the searching has been going on, at the top or near the top of Noah's Ark, because after all, what does the Bible say? The ark came to rest on Mount Ararat. Well, read the Bible carefully. It doesn't say the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat. Here's the text itself. You can actually read it there in the background. It says the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. So it doesn't say Mount Ararat, it says the mountain range of Ararat. Okay, what are the mountains of Ararat? The mountains of Ararat encompass the region of this red ellipse. So those are the mountains of Ararat. Mount Ararat is kind of right in here, but that's called the mountains of Ararat. In fact, Armenians have traditionally referred to this region as their nation. So the ancient name for the nation of Armenia were the mountains of Ararat, and it encompassed this whole region. Armenia is now just in this portion right here, considerably smaller than it was before the Turkish genocide of the Armenians. But, from Yerevan, you can actually look out and see Mount Ararat, even though it's about 100 miles away, kind of like us here in Redding looking out at Mount Shasta. Now, the text says the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Well, given the flood model I just laid out, you're not going to have thousands of feet of water above sea level. Hundreds maybe, but you're not going to get thousands. So I believe the most likely place where the ark came to rest was in the southern portion of the mountains of Ararat. And notice that the Mesopotamian plain ends at the mountains of Ararat. And so the ark is floating around in the Persian Gulf and on up into Mesopotamia, and finally comes to rest at this location right here. Well, given that that's the most likely resting spot for the ark, and let me show you based on the plain. There's the Mesopotamian plain you can see there. So easily you got this shallow plain that could take the ark all the way up to there. This is the 300 feet above sea level. This one's 600 feet above sea level. So with just a few hundred feet of water, it could easily take the ark all the way up to the south portion of the mountains of Ararat. Now, what you notice in Genesis 11 is shortly after Noah's ark comes to rest, we notice that the post-flood inhabitants build 6 cities in the plain of Mesopotamia. Genesis 11 names all 6 cities. Well, one of those cities is the city of Nineveh. Well, here's the location of Nineveh relative to the most likely spot for the resting of the Ark of Noah. Now, it tells us in the Bible that the ark was 450 feet long, 45 feet, it was 75 feet wide, 45 feet high, if you use a short cubit. If you use a long cubit, it's twice that big. So something between the size of a small aircraft carrier and a full-sized aircraft carrier. It also tells us the ark was made out of gopher wood. Well, nobody knows what gopher wood is. Well, we actually have a clue, because we know if the ark were made out of oak, it couldn't be made that big. The biggest boat ever made out of oak is about 350 feet long. Once it gets bigger than that, the tensile strength of the oak is not sufficient to hold the hold the boat together. So that explains why the seafaring boats of the early years of the history of America were typically about 250 to 300 feet long. That was just simply a limitation of the oak they used to build the ark. What does that tell us? Gopher wood has to have a higher tensile strength than oak. And there are some woods that do. In fact, there are woods that have a higher tensile strength than aluminum. They don't float in water, but they're very strong woods. They're gum woods. But these are woods that would be very valuable as building material. And given that the ark was made out of this high quality, high tensile strength lumber, there's no way the post-flood peoples would leave it lying around. So where do I think the wood from Noah's Ark is going to be found? In the ashes of Nineveh. Nineveh has been burnt to the ground over a dozen times. So the best you're going to be able to do is find the ashes that are the remains of the gopher wood that made up Noah's Ark. That's your best hope. But I don't leave much hope for that either. It's really hard to identify from ashes that have been burnt over several dozen times what it might resort to. So given how close the ark likely landing site is to the ancient city of Nineveh, there's no realistic hope for finding any of the ark's remains. I hope you've enjoyed watching this DVD in Noah's Flood. We're working hard at Reasons to Believe to produce high-quality, verifiable, and testable models that we believe that the mind behind the creation of the universe is the God of the Bible, and that the record of nature and the words of Scripture, being authored by the same person, never contradict. For more information or for access to more of our resources, visit our website at reasons.org or call 1-800-482-3700. 7836.